Good afternoon. My name is Anita Kabaka-Fox. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Queensland, and I will be hosting today's JK Tech seminar. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, Tim. But before I kick off, I just wanted to undertake the acknowledgement of country. So the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to the Australian and indeed to the global society. So thank you very much. Now, the topic of today's seminar is something which I hope you find interesting and maybe a little bit different to some of the other seminars you've seen in this series. So what I wanted to talk about today was looking at mine waste and its potential as a resource for the future. So I've called this talk today Mine Waste Transformation Through Characterisation, Unlocking New Opportunities for Australian Mining Sector. So there's a big opportunity right now to actually look at these materials as a potential resource. There's many startup companies that have popped up in this space over the past 5 years, Regeneration Enterprises, Future Towers, many others. And really what they're looking at is seeing if there is a viable opportunity and, a business case to be developed for actually looking at these, these mine tailings, these waste rock materials as potential sources of critical metals, of base metals, of precious metals, and indeed of other minerals. I mean, could there be potential sources of high purity alumina, high purity quartz? Many opportunities on the table here. So what we're going to do is we're going to unpack how we can actually, start to make an assessment as to whether or not a potential site like the one you're looking at here, which is a very famous tailings storage facility, how we can actually start to understand the characteristics of these to start making decisions about whether or not it is worth investing in developing that business case. And if it is worth investing in that business case, what technologies we actually need to make it possible. So that's going to be sort of what we're going to talk about in the next little while. But before I kick off, I just wanted to explain a bit about who I am. So I did say I'm an associate professor here at the Sustainable Minerals Institute. So I work within a group called the BRC, and obviously the seminar that was given to you a fortnight ago was from my colleague, Professor Andre Van Ass, who's the group leader of Deep Mining Geoscience. So my team, which is called Mine Waste Transformation Through Characterisation, actually sits within the BRC as a sister group to Andre's group there. So, essentially what we do is we look at, how we can actually take these mined materials, these processed materials, and characterise them to find those additional value add opportunities. And so just as a bit of a background in terms of some fun facts about us, I'm just listing it here. We were actually founded in 2021, so we're quite a new group within the SMI, and currently we have about 16 team members, and that spans from PhD students, research students to research assistants, postdocs and professors like myself. We have mine waste characterisation packages that span across the life of mine, and I'll unpack what that means a little bit later on. We work with state government and industry clients, and we also, have lots of partnerships with METS companies, because the technologies that METS companies, have really are going to be pivotal to help us actually unlock the value contained in mine waste materials. We have about 50 Stream 1 projects that we've sampled across Australia, and as I go through this presentation, you'll understand what Stream 1 means a little bit later on. And what we've seen is a lot of investment in this area of kind of research science. So, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, what's your biggest research grant? I probably would have said $20,000, $30,000. But now we're seeing significant dollars being spent on actually generating this data, because it's very much regarded as pre-competitive data. So what we're sort of outputting to, the Australian community and the mining sector are really a series of pre-competitive data reports. And so these data reports, they sit within various government portals and other places like that, and they can be downloaded, and they are regarded as kind of that first step towards kind of identifying which potential mine waste site could be useful or could be worth sort of further exploring to actually recover critical metals and other things that we need to meet sort of the future needs in terms of resources and the energy transitions. So I can't continue this presentation without acknowledging the MyWatch team. And so you're looking at the current cohort of MyWatchers on the screen there. As I said, we've got about 16 members, and that includes some of our excellent students, in particular, Enrique, Olivia and Lauren. And I'm going to show some of Olivia and Lauren's PhD results a little bit later on. And also, I must acknowledge some of the MyWatch members who have been with us and have since moved on, but really have been on this journey that we sort of started out in 2021. So thank you very much. We also work closely with other members across the BRC and the SMI. So big shout out here to Nathan Fox, who's one of the geologists in the BRC, who does work quite closely with the MineWatch team and help us with some of our characterisation work. So thank you very much to him too. Now, I'm actually going to get stuck into my point for today. So, you know, the energy transition, I mean, it's the hottest topic globally. I mean, we all know that we need to kind of find new critical metals, we need to change our energy sources, and we need to do that in order to meet our net zero targets. You know, after COVID, I did used to sort of wonder to myself, what's going to be the hot topic after COVID? And it felt like obviously COVID went on forever. But clearly, it's been the energy transition, you know, climate change, energy transition. We know it's been sort of boiling away for the past sort of decades. Since I was a teenager at school, you know, climate change was a hot topic, you know, in the 80s and the 90s too. But, you know, all of a sudden, we've kind of shifted up a gear and we are really seriously thinking about how we can meet that future need. And, you know, I guess I was kind of ripping off some articles a little bit earlier on. I was like, well, you know, where are some examples of publications where we're talking about it? And, you know, just today, doing a general search, you know, article after article around the whole planet, everyone's looking at, you know, where can we find these critical metals? What technologies do we need to actually help us recover these critical metals? So there's lots and lots of, you know, interest around critical metals. And, you know, indeed, exploration, mineral processing, and there's new waste streams that obviously are being generated through, obviously, our transition towards, you know, increased mining to meet our critical metal need that we have. Now, interestingly, you know, in recognition of the fact that we do need to mine for more critical metals, we see some big statements coming out from, you know, global politicians and indeed the UN Secretary General just last month, you know, in sort of formulating a new panel to look at sort of critical minerals and sort of supply risk, you know, across the global community. You know, he made this statement that, you know, for developing countries with large reserves, you know, they may have a lot of critical minerals, but it can result in environmental degradation. So, I mean, he made this statement, too often production of these minerals leaves a toxic cloud in its wake, pollution, wounded communities, childhoods lost to labour. And he very clearly stated, we cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. And I think, you know, as a generation, you know, we're at this very pivotal point where, you know, we understand some of the problems that we've, you know, made in the past through mining practices in terms of the environment. But now, as we're obviously going to push to mine more, we've got an opportunity to avoid the way in which we manage these mine waste materials to actually reduce the legacy that we leave. So reduce the possibility for toxic clouds and indeed for pollution. And so, you know, we talk a lot, or we hear a lot about net zero, you know, even my kids, they're across what net zero means in terms of climate change. But sometimes it troubles me that net zero doesn't quite extend to looking at net zero mine waste. I mean, you know, the statement that the Secretary General made was very clear in terms of articulating that we can't make the same mistakes again, which means that when it comes to mine waste materials, we do need to find a different strategy for its management, because if we look across lots and lots of waste sectors, and, you know, maybe the statistics are a little bit old now, but I think in terms of the orders of magnitude, that certainly hasn't changed. If we look across a range of sort of industries that we have, plastic, food, textiles, furniture, e-waste, you know, as a global community, we seem a lot more concerned to find recycling opportunities or reduction opportunities in the case of plastic, you know, to manage that waste footprint, you know. But when we look at mine waste materials, we can see that it far outstrips, you know, in terms of the volumes, far outstrips, you know, the amount that these other industries make. Yet as a global community, we're not really as invested in terms of reuse, recycling, you know, circular economy principles when it comes to mine waste materials. But we really should be, because obviously the graphic that I put at the back here, this shows what happens when we don't take it seriously in terms of our mine waste management. We can form acid and metalliferous drainage. And that's what you're looking at here. Now, these are some classic examples from different climates across Australia that I've been fortunate or unfortunate to go and visit and work at. So, you know, really, here's the challenge. I mean, you know, what do we do differently? What can we change so then we can actually start thinking about or moving towards actually a net zero mine waste future? And I do think as a global community, we need to be thinking a little bit more seriously about actually mandating the need for net zero mine waste. I think I'm not the only one who's sort of on board with that messaging, because, I definitely, I used to lecture down in Tasmania. And so, I don't know, for the past decade plus, I would show my students this slide and we'd look at how sort of things have changed from one year to the next. But one trend that I've seen is that over the past few years, ESG, or environmental, social and governance, that's really dominated the #1 risk in mining, as surveyed by EY. It's stayed in the #1 position for, since 2023, 2024. I think in 2022, it was sort of sitting up there. And we can also see that, other things like climate change feature in there as well. License to operate, that features in there as well. And all of these are kind of related to mine waste. I mean, if we unpack, the ESG kind of results there, people in the survey were asked, which are the ESG factors that, are facing most scrutiny from investors in 2024? And tailings and waste management was the second, voted in that category. So I do think that sort of our mining sector are very well aware that when it comes to mine waste materials, and of course the fact that we're going to generate more in the future, we do need to be doing something different. Because if we don't do something different, what are we going to see? And we're, unfortunately, we're likely to see more incidences like this. And this is obviously Brumadinho. This happened obviously in 2019, where a massive tailings storage failure occurred. And unfortunately, even since the establishment of the global industry standard on tailings management, even since its publication, we've continued to see some tailings and other waste feature failures too. Even just recently this year, there's been sort of the report of several of these events, not quite on the same magnitude as Brumadinho, but of course it's still happening. And as the climate continues to evolve and change, more and more extreme weather events happening, we're going to see more and more failures inevitably happen when it comes to sort of the integrity of these dam walls. In the wake of Brumadinho, it was actually really good to see leadership taken by, the financiers, the ICMM, working with other groups such as the UN and PRI, to actually come together and in consultation with academics and others to actually come up with the new industry standard on tailings management. So from obviously, something very tragic and very awful, something positive obviously was born from it, and that's obviously this standard here. And we are seeing across the industry, people are uptaking the principle, the 15 principles that were outlined, the 77 auditable requirements are being addressed, and tailings storage facilities are being built to better codes, and indeed those that are already operating are sort of being updated so then they conform a bit better, which is great. However, there's one thing that still troubles me, because after climate change, acid and metalliferous drainage, or AMD, as I previously showed you on another slide, after climate change, the UN once voted that AMD was the biggest environmental challenge facing our global community. And you're looking at an example of AMD right here on this screen. And what you're seeing here is, you've got runoff coming from the Mount Lyell mine, which is in Western Tasmania. It's a copper mine operating for, many decades. I think currently in care and maintenance, but possibly about to sort of go back into production. But you're seeing low pH waters coming from that mine site and actually hitting the Queen River here. And actually what it's caused is environmental degradation of the Queen River all the way down to the King River Delta in Strawton. And so that entire stretch of river, that's about 30 to 40 kilometres, is aquatically dead. I mean, it's low pH. You've got metals, heavy metals that are in solution at, above acceptable concentrations. So if, it was once voted, the second biggest environmental challenge facing our global community, I do ask myself why there isn't a standard, much like there is for geotechnical stability, as I showed you in the last slide. Why isn't there a global standard to actually help us mitigate against this? And I think as a global community, that's something that we do need to move towards. So that's just something to think about there. Because again, if we don't get a better handle on the way that we manage our mine waste materials right now, and we generate more and more, and they contain reactive sulfides like pyrite, which inevitably they will, we're going to see more and more examples of AMD. And we simply can't afford to have that. So, circling back to what my team do, we're called MyWatch, as I said, Mine Waste Transformation through Characterisation. And really what we've been doing is, looking at how we can actually apply geometallurgical tools to enable geoenvironmental characterisation of mine waste across the life of mine. And so we work in 3 thematic areas. What I'm going to do, though, is spend a bit of time talking about theme 3 here, because in theme 3, we actually work on characterising historical mine sites, so mine sites where we already have mine waste materials. Not always does it have to be historical. Basically, it can be an active site, an operational site, or an abandoned site, but just basically somewhere where there's existing mine waste materials. And we're actually going to those sites, we're sampling those materials, and we're actually examining, what the residual metal value could potentially be at those sites. And so I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that now. So I'm going to focus on our theme 3 area. And so I've talked a little bit about critical metals. And so for people like myself working in, mine waste, characterising it, thinking about its management, thinking about AMD reduction, after Brumadinho, there was another thing that happened, and that was, the world's thirst for critical minerals suddenly growing. And for those of us working in mine waste, it was a bit of a game changer in terms of now people thinking, actually, these materials, instead of being, hosts of all of these, heavy metals and these toxic elements that we don't want in riverine environments and aquatic communities, all of a sudden, the question was being posed a bit differently, because they were actually being recognised as potential sources of some of these things that are listed here. So once Australia put out their critical mineral strategy, it was really a game changer for those of us working in this sector. So certainly in some of the projects that I've worked on in this space, some of the key metals, that we've been chasing are sort of highlighted here. Now we're sort of thinking, if we've got a mine waste material and it has high arsenic, potentially this could be valuable. Nickel, cobalt, tungsten, antimony, bismuth, selenium, these are things that we've commonly observed in mine waste materials. And so immediately we have this opportunity to go to these sites and actually start understanding how they're deported, because then we think about how they could be recovered, and, that recovery could be scaled up, and actually we can grow sort of a new sort of business sector in Australia from mine waste materials. And so, remining mine waste isn't necessarily a new concept. I'm going to caveat that because it's not new. People have been doing it for decades, very publicly or even very quietly within sort of their flow sheets and their business organisations. So I'm just sharing with you some examples of, some relatively well-known examples of remining mine waste here in Australia. So obviously the Century Mine is probably the most famous example. So New Century Resources, they went back in after MMG sort of down tools, and they took on the tailings. They sort of took it over. And what they did was through hydraulic mining, which you're seeing there, they actually were able to sort of go back, look at the 77 million tonnes of tailings and pull out additional zinc from those materials. Zinc was the primary commodity. They recognised there was zinc still residual, and they can make a business out of it. And, as far as I'm aware, it's currently still active. It's doing what it said it was going to do on the tin, and life's good up in Queensland. Now, there's other examples of kind of exploration or production in a similar way, and that's the Helier gold mine down in Tasmania. So very different geography, very different ore system down there, but certainly what we're looking at here is, a polymetallic tailings deposit. So, associated with the Mount Reid volcanics was the Helier deposit, polymetallic. Tailings, still has that residual signature of, those base metals, gold and silver. And, certainly, through the Helier gold mines operations and with EnviroGold's help, they've been able to sort of recover those base metals and those precious metals too from those tailings. Another good example in Australia. Now, the Mount Morgan story is a little bit different. So here we actually have Heritage Minerals who've gone back to the site with a lot of support from the federal and indeed the state government to actually build a new plant to reprocess the tailings and continue to recover gold from those residual tailings that are present at the site. And I think one of the things that has helped them to sort of unlock the opportunity there is also to introduce new sort of processing approaches and technologies. So certainly part of their flow sheet design is to use their resin process, where they kind of are recycling cyanide to sort of unlock the opportunity to recover the gold from those tailings. So that's sort of a pilot plant a full-scale plant that's being built with the support of the government, which is great. And another company that's had a lot of government support to sort of help them, move their operations along is Mount Carbine. So again, located in Queensland. Here we've got an example of critical metal recovery. So tungsten's a critical metal. Obviously, it's very important, and it's very well endowed in the Northeast Minerals Province. But EQ Resources recognising that there was the opportunity to sort of recover additional tungsten from the quarried materials, some of the waste rock, and indeed from the tailings there, using sort of X-ray sorting technologies, that's really helped them unlock the value of the tungsten there and actually deliver product to market, which has been brilliant. Not only have they sort of been able to do that, but through their screening process, it's not just tungsten they've delivered. I mean, they're probably one of the mines that we could sort of, pitch as almost being a net zero waste sort of mine, because in doing that reprocessing and indeed future processing through the sort of the X-ray sorting technologies of being able to really sort of identify where their ore minerals are, they've been able to segregate their sort of their waste materials, and they've been used to sort of send to other markets as aggregates and so forth. So that's a really good news story there from Mount Carbine, and indeed an example of how we're starting to see critical metals actually exploited from mine waste materials. But there's many, many other opportunities. And so what you're looking at here is the Atlas of Australian Mine Waste. And this is something that Geoscience Australia, in collaboration with RMIT, and indeed with now with some collaboration from us here at UQ, they actually, they went back to kind of looking at all the state government reports and recordings of where mine waste materials are located across the country, and started to map it out. I mean, indeed, they've all got slightly different colours and icons, and that really sort of reflects the primary ore that was sort of being mined at that site. So, this is a really good resource if you do kind of want to understand where Australia's mine waste is. And really, the motivation for this, one of the motivations for going back and having a look at these mine waste materials in this context and mapping it out was obviously to help us identify those opportunities for going back and reprocessing. And certainly, the other driver in this story is the circular economy. So we know that Australia wants to grow its circular economy sector. We're supposed to have output 26 billion by 2025, as a gross net kind of produce from the circular economy. I'm not sure if we're quite there yet, but certainly, reprocessing mine waste and the volumes that we have there and the potential value that could be sitting there. For example, think about gold. There's a massive opportunity for mine waste to contribute very significantly to the circular economy. So, what they're showing here are probably some of the highlight sites here, but, if you really delve into it, other reports will say that there's about 50,000 mine waste sites sitting across the country. So there's plenty of exploration work to do, and certainly that's what our team have been doing. So, in our Theme 3 programme, what we've been doing is actually, funded by state governments. We've been going back to, some of the key sites that were identified here and actually characterising them as a Stream 1 programme. I mentioned at the start that, we do these Stream 1s. What that means is that we go to a site and we undertake kind of a rapid assessment of the mine waste in terms of its critical metal fertility. So I guess the funding that we've been given has been very much laser focused on critical metal exploration. And so that's why I'm a little bit sort of focused on that in this sort of presentation today. Certainly the funding we've got has, facilitated us to undertake an integrated chemical assay, mineralogy and mineral chemistry program. And the reason we do that is because it's a very quick way, so think of it as a rapid fertility test to actually understand if the site is fertile for those critical metals, and it provides us enough information to start thinking about which mineral processing methodologies would be appropriate to actually start recovering that value from that material. In our Stream 2 programme, I'm going to touch on it very briefly in the presentation, that's where we've had the opportunity, where we've recognised that there's value, to go back to that site and actually do some detailed site investigation. So take the rigs, instead of variability testing as we do in Stream 1, where we sample per facies, in Stream 2, it's more like sampling per meterage to actually collect those parameters we would need to go into, modelling, so then we can actually start thinking about what's there and start talking, resource modelling, indicated, inferred, what's the value here. And in Stream 3, that's kind of where, if we see anything that sort of piques our interest in Streams 1 and 2, we can actually start thinking about which mineral processing methodologies are going to be needed to actually recover the value from that particular site. Because, as anyone will tell me, which they have done many, many times, there's no point in, refloating tailings because they've been through flotation once. So you can't expect the same outcome or a better outcome by floating it again. And I fundamentally agree. Of course, that's true. If you're floating tailings because you're trying to recover base metals from sphalerite, and then you try and do that again on the tailings, then you're going to have to optimize the flotation chemistry or change some parameters, see if that might significantly work. But the chances are it probably won't. I don't know. But, if you were actually looking in that material, say within that sphalerite, or that body of material, it wasn't just sphalerite that was there, but there was also pyrite there, and that pyrite was elevated in cobalt. But that wasn't the primary target, and it's since been concentrated in the tailings. That's what we want to kind of go back and have a look at. So I guess it's reprocessing tailings or reprocessing mine waste and trying new ways to get new value, perhaps out of a different set of minerals that you weren't originally interested in the first place. So that's sort of a little bit of an overview of the sort of the thematic programs, the stream programs that sit within theme 3. So I'm going to focus a little bit on our stream 1 program now. And, I'm not sure if everyone who's dialed in today has actually been to many tailings storage facilities. So I love this drone video, which was produced by the Department of Resources here in Queensland on one of our site investigations, because what you're looking at here is a tailings storage facility, and it goes to show you the diversity or the types of situation you could face. And so sitting here in the Queensland sunshine, you can see that we've got part of the area that's sitting under a very shallow water cover. We can see that here we've got a front of salt precipitation, and if you really look carefully, you can see that there's lots and lots of different salts that are precipitated. So you see lots of different colours of salts, which to me as an environmental geochemist tell me that we have lots of different metals that sit within the eventual sulfide zone. So what you're looking at there is kind of the oxide sort of zone that's formed on top of the sulfide zone, which is at depth. We've augured this site extensively to at least 10 metres, and we've intersected that sort of sulfidic horizon within sort of 1 to 2 metres. You can see how vast these areas are in terms of the opportunity. There's more tailings that have since gone on to this TSF, but that's the kind of environment that we're dealing with, and we need to characterise. And so there's lots of sites like that sitting in Queensland. So that gives you a flavour of what a TSF actually looks like, boots on ground. And as I said, we undertake the Stream 1 sampling program. And so that's kind of an overview of what a Stream 1 program looks like. So we go to the site, face-like sites like I just showed you. We have to come up with a mine waste sampling program. And so we like to sort of dig into what existing knowledge and data there is on the site to come up with a way in which we're going to sample the site. Once we've sampled, we then undertake, chemical assay program, 48 elements. And so our sampling campaign is a little bit limited to the funding that we've got. It's not based on geostatistics. It's literally based on funding at this point. But we take about 80, if we can, 80 plus or thereabouts samples from the site. And as I say, in the Stream 1 campaign, we're really looking at variability testing. So we will sample per facies. So in recognising that these environments are much like sedimentary environments, we term the different sort of visual kind of differences in the material that we observe and encounter, we term those sort of different layers as facies to adopt the similar sort of linguistics as sedimentary geology. Once we've kind of done our chemical assay program, we then do a very targeted mineralogical program. So those, after the chemical assay program, we can start to identify, which critical metals are endowed in these materials. And through kind of screening with other metals that we've measured, we can start to approximate what the likely mineralogy will be. But then we actually choose, and we do bias it, but we certainly choose, the samples that are most endowed in the critical metal of interest. And we do a detailed sort of bulk and in situ mineralogical study to understand, which minerals are there and how they're actually arranged in the tailings material or the other waste rock that we're sampling. And indeed, it can't be forgotten, but, how the metal of interest or the critical metal of interest is sitting within its host mineral is also important for us to understand, because together all of these pieces of information help us, start to think about what the right reprocessing technology might look like for a particular site. And so we've been quite busy, the team and I. We've been sampling like mad across the country, and so that gives you a snapshot of where we've sampled. Certainly we've worked with lots and lots of different state governments, and I absolutely thank them from the bottom of my heart for their support, both financially, weekly meetings, catching up, boots on ground assistance. It's been amazing to collaborate with so many different state governments and indeed Geoscience Australia to actually help us start to understand the contained value in our mine waste materials. We have had opportunities to work directly with companies too, so I've got their logos and I'm acknowledging their contributions too. But I will say that the data we've collected with the state governments and indeed Geoscience Australia is really important, because that's the public data that's being fed into the Atlas of Australian Mine Waste. So I did sort of say that I inferred that the sort of the knowledge that my watch are generating is, going to feed into the next iteration of the Atlas of Australian Mine Waste, and it absolutely is. So, the data we're collecting will obviously be eventually fed into the back end of the Atlas of Australian Mine Waste, and will be available for people to sort of delve into in the future. So as I said, we're developing pre-competitive data for investors seeking critical metal waste sites. And indeed, for us as scientists, we're generating new knowledge of Australia's ore deposit waste signatures, and indeed sort of getting early indications of their processability. And it's really important for us to generate that knowledge, because as we see other countries and other parts of our global geography start to get interested in undertaking a similar kind of mapping approach, if there's, a desktop sort of resource they could use to sort of have a look and sort of think, right, well, these IOCG deposits, they actually have signatures of cobalt and nickel, and the best ways to get that out could be to do X, Y, and Z. These kind of desktop reports and sort of early indications can be very valuable to actually start to help to sort of build towards justification to go out and do some, boots and ground sampling. So, that's kind of where we're going with the work that we're doing, and certainly that's the intended outcome, to benefit, obviously, growing Australia's mine waste sector, but indeed contributing to the scientific body of knowledge. And now, I guess in the next part of this presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on only a couple of metals and sort of take you through some key results from those studies. And so when we kicked off this programme, we kicked it off first with the Queensland State Government, and they had a very big interest in looking at cobalt in the Northwest Minerals Province here in Queensland. And so, because of that, we've sort of had also a very big focus on cobalt, and indeed recognising some previous work we'd done in Tasmania, sort of on the west coast. We'd seen a signature of cobalt in Savage River. We'd seen it in Mount Lyell in the waste materials there, and we'd also seen it in the tailings that have accumulated in the King River Delta. And so for us, it had been a critical metal that we've long since been interested in. And knowing that it's very needed for battery technologies, it's certainly one to focus on as a country. And so what you're looking at here are some early results from that study. So what you're looking at is average assay values that from each of these individual campaigns at these sites. I'm sharing with you only a partial data set, because I'm not yet permitted to share with you the New South Wales data. That's under embargo until September, when the Minister will make an official announcement of the work that we're doing. So for now, if you're curious about what's there, I'm just going to have to leave you to read this paper here, which sort of explains why cobalt's so important. And indeed, through the work that Katerina Savinova here at the SMI did, they actually demonstrated that, in fact, that most of our world's cobalt actually sits in mine waste materials, and there's the opportunity to recover that quite easily there. So that's a paper to get stuck into if you're interested. But if you're actually interested in the generator that we collected, you can see that we've got two very distinct hotspots here. So in the Northern Territories, you can see that we have significant endowment in the Pico mine. And here, and that's in the Tennant Creek area, I should say, but really sort of there's a clustering of elevated values sitting in the Northwest Minerals Province, which again, as I said, when we started this project, it was an area of interest for us to actually unpack what that looks like. And there is a good reason for that, which I'll get to. And so just focusing a little bit on Queensland, that's data that I am a little bit more permitted to talk about, we can certainly see that there is that very nice cluster in that Northwest Minerals Province. And, I guess our hypothesis was when we went into it, we think that there's going to be cobalt there. And indeed, we were correct, there is cobalt there. We can see that in terms of our endowment, it certainly sits within the signature of the IOCG tailings that we've sampled. So Osborne, Great Australia, Rocklands. But we also see areas like Kurridala, which actually we sampled slag materials there. So I should caveat that, across our sampling program, it's all waste types that we sample. It's tailings, it's waste rock, it's slag, it's spent heap leach materials, it's coal residues, it's other metallurgical wastes like, phosphogypsum slimes. What it hasn't been yet is red mud, and that's probably the only waste stream that we haven't yet sampled, and it's something that I'd like to do in the future. But certainly what you can see is, there is that endowment in the Northwest Minerals Province. And we wanted to investigate that a little bit further, certainly through a Stream 2 program at one site, Capricorn Copper. And so what you're looking at here is kind of the overall approach that one of our PhD students, Laura Nichols, took. And so, what she did was, she undertook a geometallurgical characterisation approach to the tailings, and I'll unpack what that means in the next few slides. And so if you cast your mind back to that drone footage that I showed you going over that tailings storage facility, that was actually this site. And so what Lauren and the team did, particularly working with the Department of Resources Geo, so big thanks to them, is, they went out to site and they did this hand auger drilling campaign. And so, yeah, a hand auger might seem a bit, rudimentary, a bit basic to sort of go out to site and sample with, but actually in these sorts of tailings campaigns, it's the best tool that you can have, because in terms of getting health and safety clearance to go out and sample on a dam, it's pretty easy to actually get the approvals to go out and sample, as opposed to if you were taking out a sonic rig. It obviously costs a lot less. You can take it on a plane. So it really is the most valuable tool that we've got here. And what they did was they went across the dam. They sunk, 10-metre holes in this kind of roughly grid-style campaign. Even at the surface, we could tell that there was a lot of variability from the different efflorescent salts that we'd seen in the drone footage sort of a couple of years before, but also that Lauren observed during her campaign. And when we actually got into the guts of the tailings, this is what we were presented with. So, anyone who says to you, tailings is pretty boring, it's all homogenous, it's all the same. Absolutely not. It was so diverse. I mean, what we're looking at here, she logged, from facies A right through to facies H2. That's, 12 different facies that I'm showing you here right now. And all of them actually returned different cobalt values. So we assayed all of these the wrong way. And indeed, we could see there was lots of variability in terms of cobalt values across these different facies. And it was a really good job that we did actually go down to 10 metres in our auger campaign, or we would have missed some of the goodies that were hiding below. So facies H1 and facies H2, you can see how our cobalt value is massively spiked up. We identified, what looks like this sort of manganese oxide horizon here. And certainly we can see that there was actually vugs and cavities that are actually formed within these TSFs. Who would have thought there were these massive vugs and cavities? But within those, we actually saw these kind of efflorescence actually precipitating, and indeed this kind of greenish kind of copper clay, as we called it. So indeed, lots and lots of variability sitting within the tailings storage facility. And there's just kind of a downhole plot for this particular, for one of her holes, where you can just sort of see how the cobalt grade does sort of bounce around. In terms of, thinking about, what's actually, in these materials. So once we'd obviously done the visual sort of logging, the assaying, etc., obviously we want to understand the mineralogy in a bit more detail. And so, Lauren did a very detailed tailings mineralogy study, and you're kind of looking at the summary here. Certainly the majority or the dominance of these, of the minerals here were certainly quartz and pyrite and indeed feldspars. When we went into it after the stream one, we actually thought, the main hosting of cobalt sits within pyrite and potentially manganese oxides, which we'd noted from the separate waste rock studies, so Asbalene in particular. But when she actually got stuck into it and really unpacked sort of what the tailings mineralogy was, we were actually able to identify that there were actually a few other cobalt host minerals lurking in these materials. In terms of sulfides, we had cobaltite, anaplastic, carolite, lots and lots of different oxides, and the sulfates play an important part of this story. And indeed, we saw some graphitic material too within these materials. Now, the next thing to do was to think about, what's the liberation of these tailings, and indeed sort of some of the cobalt hosting phases. And so she did again a deep dive in terms of looking at the sulfide liberation in tailings. So she chose sort of 4 sulfides here that you're looking at here. And what we can see is that on average, apart from anaplastic, we certainly saw that pyrite, cobaltite and carolite were quite well liberated. So, in terms of thinking about metal recovery, further mineral processing, that's quite good. But again, as we kind of got stuck into, some of the particles where, potentially pyrite wasn't, which is shown in green, where it wasn't sort of well liberated, we can see that we're in very complex sort of agglomerates and sort of complicated mineralogical situations here. So, these tailings are, far from easy to deal with, as anyone in this field knows. Now, the next thing to think about was obviously the particle size distribution. And, she again looked at sort of the P80s for her different tailings and, plotting that on the elephant sort of curve, which obviously is famously used in mineral processing. We could see that, for the majority of her pyrite, if indeed her pyrite's kind of the dominant sort of cobalt sulfide phase that we've got, or cobalt hosting sulfide phase we've got, we can certainly see that, you know, some of her grains are sitting outside of that conventional realm. So actually, we probably are going to have to think about using fine particle flotation methods to actually recover as much cobalt from these pyrites as we can. Digging into it a bit further, you know, who doesn't love an SEM or a backscattered electron image? I certainly love them. So here's something to cheer up your afternoon. You know, Lauren, she spent a lot of time on the SEM, you know, trying to unpack the pyrite textures that she could see. And again, very diverse. I mean, we've got pyrite with galena here, and galena inclusions. We've got, you know, rimming with copper on this particular pyrite phase. We've got very intensely weathered pyrite, you know, pyrite with cobaltite rims of different thickness, as you can see here, and, you know, just some pyrite in this kind of agglomerated weathered mass as well. So, you know, the diversity is definitely there, which obviously makes it very difficult when we think about which pyrite types to target for cobalt recovery. And so the next part of what she did was really to sort of step through looking at, you know, what's the tenor of cobalt within these different, you know, pyrites that we sort of chose to sort of champion in our sort of laser ablation study. And so she went through and she did a big laser ablation study. She was sort of trying to target cobaltiferous pyrite. And what she sort of observed was, that these were the targets that she should have for cobaltiferous pyrite, I beg your pardon. So she saw, you know, over large versus small grains, that our small grains were sort of more endowed. Our fractured grains and our porous grains were sort of, again, more endowed, and those that were also altered versus clean. So she was able to sort of start to identify which potential, you know, pyrites are, you know, hosting the most cobalt. And this is useful information to build towards sort of thinking about mineral processing strategies. And so what she also recognised within our laser ablation campaign was that we actually had a whole bunch of other critical metals sitting within her pyrite, which we could also think about, you know, recovering as part of that process. And so where Lauren's up to now is sort of starting sort of some stream 3 work, where she's sort of been using all of that data that she's collected, sort of starting to do some flotation test work to work out how she could actually recover that value. And that's been going pretty well. That's not the only site. Obviously, I showed you a list of sort of sites that we're looking at. So certainly we've been doing some work with JOGME, which is a Japanese organisation, looking at the Rocklands tailings there. So we've done sort of a very decent sort of stream 1 campaign there and sort of some modelling work. And, you know, what we saw is that, yes, we do have elevated cobalt grade in those tailings. And working with JOGME, they've actually come up and patented, or are in the process of patenting, a carrier flotation method there, where we can actually concentrate the pyrite and then sort of extract the cobalt from that pyrite column. Working with Cobalt Blue, who's in some ways a bit of a new kid on the block to kind of the technology space, they've developed a proprietary technology which is focused, you know, almost exclusively on pyrite. They sort of kicked off, you know, looking at sort of extracting cobalt from pyrite, but obviously there's other things they can recover from that pyrite, such as sulfur, which is obviously needed for sulfuric acid production and sort of various other agricultural output industries too. So doing some test work with them at the Osborne mine, you know, we took some bulk samples after sort of the Stream 1 campaign, ran it through the Cobalt Blue process, and what we could see there, in comparison to sort of conventional flotation, we could see that sort of going through their roast and their leach process, we were able to recover a lot more cobalt, and indeed cobalt, I should say, a lot more efficiently, so in much less time, which is obviously good news for that particular site. So very useful for recovering cobalt from pyrite. Now, the final site that I touch on here is one site here, Pindora, where we looked at sort of recovering cobalt from spent heap leach materials. So this is kind of cobalt that was hosted in various oxides, which you can't quite make out there, but we certainly have, you know, broken-tite, we have, you know, copper oxides, iron oxides, etc. And so using their proprietary technology, again, we kind of targeted sort of cobalt recovery, and we could see that using their, you know, their new sort of methodology, you know, we could recover copper and cobalt quite efficiently in comparison to some sort of more conventional tests. And so this has been great for the state government here in Queensland. It's actually helped to generate lots of interest in mine waste in the state, which has been great. So, you know, last year, and probably almost this time last year, Evolution Mining, they were actually given about $2.2 million to retrieve cobalt from mine waste through a federal government grant. I can't believe that, you know, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, do you reckon that, you know, somebody would get 2.2 million from the federal government to retrieve cobalt from mine waste? I'd have said, no, you're kidding me. But yet here we are, and how fantastic is that? And certainly, you know, some of the work we've been doing with the Queensland state government, I hope has helped to sort of you know, encourage them to actually put money up for explorers to do this type of work themselves. So actually, you know, just last month we saw an announcement from the Queensland state government that they're actually going to invest $5 million to drive critical mineral discoveries in mine waste. So again, you know, I do hope that sort of MineWatch are a part of this journey to see new funding actually put in to encourage explorers to sort of take a bit more ownership to go and do this type of work themselves and indeed upscale it. So good news. Now, there's lots of other critical metals that we could look at too. I'm going to just very quickly touch on indium. So indium is a critical metal that's really important for lots and lots of reasons, for solar panel technologies and indeed for touchscreen technologies. So, you know, your kids, you know, they love indium probably more than you could ever imagine, because without it, they wouldn't be able to browse on their phones. But certainly, you know, we had a good look at where our indium sits in Queensland, and we could see that there was a very distinct signature of indium in our northeast minerals province. And so one of our PhD candidates, Olivia Maheas, has done a very deep dive in her PhD looking at indium. And if you're interested to read a bit more about its deportment in ore and mine waste, she wrote a great paper last year, which you're free to download to get up to speed. And so in her research, we wanted to look at the difference of indium deportment in two sites. And we chose Balgammon, which obviously is an intrusion-related granite sort of system, and indeed Mount Morgan, which is obviously a volcanic massive sulfide. Both are known, you know, to have elevated indium. So we kind of wanted to unpack the different characteristics and sort of understand, you know, from a metallurgical point of view, what the difference might be to recover that value. So, you know, this is Balgammon. You can see it here. It's located, as I said, in the northeast minerals province. We have, you know, some mine waste, rock piles, not necessarily tailings here because the processing was done at Mount Garnet. But what we do have is, with these polysulfidic waste rock materials that sit there, you know, it's impacting on the Walsh River and the Jamie Creek, which sits adjacent to the site. So there is that environmental AMD, you know, issue that we need to deal with. And, you know, I sort of flicked through them. I didn't share with you Mount Morgan, but you can see some images of it here. I mean, I've shown it in some previous slides. And so what we did was we did a really deep dive in terms of sampling lots and lots of different waste rock materials, waters, and you're looking at some of the sediment features here. And, you know, what Olivia did was she assayed for indium. You can see how indium concentration varies sort of here in these different sediments and waters that she's got. And, you know, when we think about crustal abundance of indium being sort of less than 1 ppm, you know, this isn't, you know, insignificant to see that we have 1.6 ppm just in these sludges alone. But what was really interesting was probably some of the features that we saw at Balgammon. And so you're looking at some sort of cavities here, sort of associated with some of the open cuts. And we can see that there's kind of these stalactites that have formed. And when we sampled those, we could actually see significant endowment in indium in these sort of materials too. So up to 175 ppm sort of sampled here. That's fantastic. And I suppose it got us excited then to think about, you know, what the microbiology could look like at this site. And so what you're looking at here is some of the microbiological features. So we took those stalactites, put them under sort of different conditions. You know, we preserved them in the field, put them under an SEM back in sort of the geobiology lab, working with collaborators, Paul Evans and Sam. And we can see these biogenic textures, which means that potentially maybe we could undertake bioleaching at these sites, and maybe bioleaching could be the mechanism by which we can recover indium from these polysulfidic materials, waste rock materials at this potential site. And so where we're at now with that particular study is looking at the DNA sequencing of the different bacteria that we sampled across lots of different points, which, you know, Olivia's got a separate presentation on this that I can share that she gave last week. But certainly, you know, we're starting that DNA sequencing. And what we're finding is a lot of these bacteria are not even named yet. So, I mean, in terms of like, you know, science and sort of being a geeky scientist a little bit, you know, there's an opportunity here to actually make some really significant new discoveries. But from a business point of view, we've got the opportunity to, you know, understand or try and understand these bacteria and see how they could be cultivated to actually help us do bioleaching effectively for these polysulfidic materials. And so that's kind of where we're at, sort of looking at sort of taking that work forward. We have been doing work with HVP technology, which is something else that's been developed here at SMI, where we're looking at sort of breaking those very polysulfidic waste rock materials into sulfide gangue and non-sulfide gangue. And we've also been doing some TOMRA sorting trials to actually also help with that sort of sorting that waste rock in field, because there's literally no point in making these observations if we don't have technologies that we can actually deploy to site that will help us do kind of that segregation of rocks in field and also have the technologies where we're back in the lab that will help us sort of do that further separation too. So using some of those new technologies, I think we can start to map out how we could actually go about reprocessing a site like this and recovering this very valuable critical metal from these waste materials. Now, rare earth elements is something else that's obviously very popular within Australia. I haven't shown you, well, actually, this isn't the most up-to-date map, but certainly in Port Pirie, we have seen a very significant elevation there of light rare earth elements. But certainly, again, sort of focusing a little bit on Queensland, we can see there's quite a lot of endowment of rare earth elements in the Northwest Minerals Province. And largely that comes from the Mary Kathleen mine, as you can see there. And we've done some further work at the Mary Kathleen mine. Certainly the tailings is something that our hydromet teams, our phytomining guys at the CMLR, and indeed Gordon Southern's geobiology group in the School of the Environment at UQ have been working heavily and furiously on over the past few years to work out how we can actually recover the rare earth elements from the tailings there. And the rare earths we have are cerium and lanthanum. And we've also done a waste rock study here as well. So I mean, obviously the tailings gets quite a lot of the feature, or gets quite a lot of the attention, but there's a significant volume of waste rock material sitting around the Mary Kathleen site as well. And, you know, going back and resampling that, we can certainly see there's significant endowment of rare earths here. And you're looking here at sort of mapping of, you know, cerium, certainly, and neodymium using micro XRF. So obviously these new technologies also help us understand the deportment of these critical and rare earth element minerals and metals to help us sort of then identify, you know, how we need to break it to recover that value. Antimony has been a really interesting one for us. So it's not one that's often sort of, I don't know, discussed that much or considered that, you know, important, but certainly we see very significant endowment of antimony sitting in the Northern Territories around the Pine Creek area. And so, you know, working out, and that's really sitting in oxide materials. So, you know, certainly leach processes could be the way to actually unlock the antimony from those materials. Scandium, another critical metal of interest, and we see a significant endowment of that in some of our coal ash wastes. And I can't show you, you know, the New South Wales data, but we've done quite a big campaign looking at coal residues down there associated with some of those coal mines. And indeed, you know, the recovery opportunity of scandium from coal ash, you know, certainly gives that ash another reuse opportunity there too. And, you know, that's kind of some of the sampling campaigns we've done in Queensland looking at that coal ash, and these are the kind of terrains that we've been dealing with. Lithium, obviously big business in Western Australia. I don't have too many dots in Western Australia to share just now. We're sort of going through the process of sampling those and finalising some of our assay data. But certainly, you know, if you think, you know, do we have lithium in its significant endowment? Not necessarily anything that I would get too excited by just yet. Certainly we're seeing a small signature or a small sort of kick of indium sitting in Herberton and Collingwood in the Northeast Minerals Province. Is it enough to be economic? Don't think so yet, but certainly as technologies evolve, maybe there's going to be that opportunity. And it'd be bad of me not to mention, obviously, copper. So where's our copper sitting? Copper is one of our most valuable things that we need to meet the energy transition needs. And we can see, obviously, we have an endowment of copper sitting in the Northwest Minerals Province, both in oxide materials, in sulfides. So, you know, lots and lots of different technologies could be used here, including that I showed from Innoveco. So opportunities there to sort of think about, you know, developing pilot plants or test sort of facilities where we can actually show and demonstrate how they could be used, and then eventually deploy technologies like this to site where, you know, maybe multiple sources or multiple mine sites could feed their tailings into that sort of centralized processing hub, and, you know, we can get the job done in terms of recovering that value. We're only going to get the job done, though, if we have new technologies, and that's what you're looking at here. So lots and lots of new technologies are coming on board. Obviously, we have lots of conventional ones, but in order to sort of understand how we can best extract the value from, you know, this new generation of ore deposits, we do need to do further testing, you know, be it sort of early TRL level, and sort of scale it up through schemes like Trailblazer to actually see how we can actually better utilise these to actually deal with recovering critical metals from these potentially, you know, complicated materials, as Lauren's pyrites kind of showed. I've got a couple of papers on that if you're interested to learn a bit more. But, you know, I guess as a quick summary of what we've been doing, and certainly, you know, across the country, this is probably a bit of a, you know, a nice summary. These are probably the key things that we found, the key observations that we've made in the sampling campaigns that we've run. And so I think there's certainly lots and lots of opportunity for Australia to grow its secondary prospectivity sector. And I think really it's important for mining companies to know that characterising mine waste upfront, it's not a cost, it's a strategic investment. Because if you don't characterise it upfront, one day you're going to get the MyWatch team or our grandchildren or whoever coming to your site, donning, the PPE, taking out the rigs and having to go back and figure out what's there, which is kind of what we've been doing, which is why it's better to collect that data up front, which we've been doing in our Theme 1 campaign. And so I don't need to go through this. We all understand why, to meet the energy transition, we need all these technologies, these are the metals. We've talked about this already. We're going to produce additional tailings and we need to do something different. We talked about that. But what we haven't talked about is how we actually do AMD characterisation, currently. So, the status quo of how we do it is very much captured in this graphic I put together. So for 1970, it was very touchy-feely, like, this, there's some sulfide here, there's some carbonate there, very qualitative observations. After 1977, the establishment of geochemical testing, then we had a methodology. We use these geochemical tests, but we've been using them ever since the late 70s. We haven't yet innovated in the AMD space, and that's the opportunity that we have now. So now we actually have the opportunity to use new technologies like hyperspectral data, which I'm going to flick towards. We've been chomping through these data sets that companies have been collecting. We've been asking a bit more. Companies have been collecting this to sort of domain their ore bodies, understand the geotech properties, build geomet models and geology models. But they've been asking, what else can we extract from these data sets? And so we've been working with sort of a bunch of different people to actually, develop algorithms and opportunities to actually think about what else can be done with this data. And so if anyone's interested to learn more about that, then contact me. But certainly, we summarised kind of the approach that we see these new technologies taking for AMD prediction specifically in a paper that we published in Elements last year. So, as a sort of an organised snapshot, that's kind of how we recommend new technologies could be used to help with AMD prediction, which is obviously very valuable as we sort of continue to mine. We're going to produce more potentially reactive mine waste materials. But really what we should be doing is using all of this additional mineralogical data to actually design out waste from the start. I started off by saying that we need to move towards net zero mine waste. We have the technologies as we sort of are progressing, through this technology explosion right now. We have the technologies, we have the mineralogical data, we have, the chemical data. We just need to integrate that and actually think about how we can redesign our flow sheets in a new way and actually identify additional commodities that could be recovered. So byproduct, what are the byproducts we could get from extracting copper or base metals from our mine site, if that was our sort of key business? What can we do with the residual gangue material, our non-sulfide gangue? Could we sell that as aggregates or for silica? Could we actually look at new industries? Can we develop, can we actually sell our mica, for example, to make ethical cosmetics? There's lots and lots of avenues for actually, extracting more value from this. But we now have the opportunity to do this because we have more mineralogical data, and mineralogy really is the key to net zero mine waste. And we need to see more of that thinking as we move forward. And here's one nice example of that. So one thing that's been developed or certainly championed here at SMI is ore sand. And, that's really where, our team have kind of looked at, the SMI team sort of looked at how we can encourage sand co-production during mineral processing. And so, again, if you're interested to know a bit more about that, then please contact Professor Daniel Frantz here at the SMI. Lots and lots of opportunities, and that's one thing that we could do. Now, I have no time to talk about the next steps, so I'm going to leave it there. But certainly one thing to think about is there's lots of opportunities to continue to innovate in the space of characterisation. That is work that we're continuing to do in MyWatch 2.0, if we can call it that. And so, it's important that we keep the conversation going around mine waste. So we had the first Australian Mine Waste Symposium earlier this year, and we brought together 160 practitioners across lots of different disciplines. We had government, we had academics, we had mineral processors, we have METS companies all coming together to talk about how we can find a pathway forward to actually help us re-commercialise mine waste and actually grow this sector in the country. So that was great. And we need to have more conversations like that, bringing together lots and lots of different stakeholders. And so I think that's probably enough for me today. I'm going to finish there. So I just want to thank you for listening. That's a long time sort of taking a lot of information. So thanks for bearing with me. I want to thank the MyWatch team. They've been brilliant. I've got the most brilliant team of researchers working across these projects. And I also want to give a special shout out to this woman here, Kambawani, who was instrumental in helping us collect a lot of that data and has recently moved to WA to continue her tailings career with ARCA. So thank you very much. Not sure if we've got time for questions now, Tim, but certainly we can download those and email you directly with replies. So thanks for being with me this afternoon, and have a good day.